Have you ever considered what might set humanity apart in a galaxy teeming with advanced civilizations, hyper-intelligent species, and overwhelming firepower? It isn't our weaponry, our ships, or even our technology. It's something far more subtle, infinitely more subversive, and uniquely human. Imagine a moment of first contact so tense the very fabric of space seems to hold its breath. A colossal alien dreadnought, bristling with unimaginable power, hangs in the void. Its holographic emissary materializes on the bridge, a being of pure light and menace, and with a voice that echoes with the weight of empires, it declares, "Surrender your primitive species for assimilation." Now, in that terrifying, universe-defining moment, what is the appropriate human response? Panic, despair, a dignified, solemn acceptance of the inevitable? No, for Captain Vance and his crew, the answer is a dry, perfectly timed, "Oh, fantastic, we were just looking for a better dental plan." While the bridge crew stifles laughter and quietly activates stealth protocols, the alien emissary is left utterly bewildered. It has the processing power to calculate 1 billion trajectories in a nanosecond, but it possesses no framework for understanding a joke. It can analyze every particle of their ship, but it cannot analyze irony. This single, brilliant moment of sarcasm isn't just a clever retort. It's a strategic masterstroke, a psychological weapon deployed with pinpoint accuracy. It immediately establishes a dynamic the aliens cannot comprehend, buying precious seconds and revealing a fundamental weakness in their seemingly perfect logic. They expected fear, submission, or defiance. They did not expect to be mocked. This is the story of how humanity's most undervalued trait became our greatest strategic asset among the stars. It's a journey into the heart of what makes us human: our wit, our irony, our refusal to take even apocalyptic threats entirely seriously. We are about to explore how sarcasm, that sharp-edged tool of humor we use every day, functions as a form of cognitive warfare so advanced that no alien AI can counter it. We'll see how a well-placed quip can be more disarming than a plasma cannon, and how the ability to laugh in the face of oblivion might just be the key to our survival. So, if you've ever been told your sense of humor is a defense mechanism, you were right. You just didn't know it was a defense mechanism for our entire species. And so it was in a sterile meeting room aboard a Xylosian orbital platform that humanity's second great weapon was quietly and hilariously field-tested. The Xylosians were a species of profound logic and staggering literal-mindedness. Their language had no subtext, their culture no irony, and their diplomats no sense of humor whatsoever. They processed the universe in binary code. Statements were either true or false, requests were either granted or denied. This made them formidable negotiators in their own way, but utterly unprepared for senior diplomat Lena Chen. The meeting's official agenda was cultural and technological exchange, a polite first step toward potential alliance. The Xylosian ambassador, a being of chitinous plates and unblinking compound eyes, began with a Chinese letter, meticulously detailed description of their planetary weather control systems. Chen, a veteran of countless tedious summits on Earth, listened with a perfectly polite mask that concealed her profound boredom. When the ambassador finally paused, she leaned forward with a warm, diplomatic smile and uttered a phrase every human recognizes as casual, unserious small talk. "That's absolutely fascinating, Ambassador. Honestly, we'd just love to see your weapons someday." In the mind of a human, this is a throwaway line, a piece of social filler akin to "we should get lunch sometime." It carries no expectation of immediate execution. But in the hyper-literal processor of the Xylosian ambassador, it registered as a formal, enthusiastic request from a delighted ally. A series of rapid, approving clicks echoed from its thorax. "Query, you express a desire to observe our martial capabilities. This unit is pleased by your enthusiasm. The tour will commence immediately." Before Chen could politely clarify, a security detail had arrived, and she was being whisked away on what became the most comprehensive and unguarded tour of a top-tier alien armory in human history. The Xylosians, thrilled by her apparent keen interest, showed her everything. They demonstrated plasma lances that could pierce a battlecruiser's hull, explained the firing algorithms of their swarm missile clusters, and even proudly displayed the central power core for their planetary defense grid. Through it all, Chen's professional demeanor never cracked, though internally she was reeling. Her discreet glasses, standard issue for Earth diplomats, were secretly recording petabytes of data, thermal signatures, structural weak points, energy frequencies. The tour culminated in a hangar containing their newest pride, a prototype starship shielded by what they called a quantum fluctuation barrier, touted as utterly impenetrable. The head engineer, puffing out his chest plates, proclaimed, "This defensive matrix is impervious to all known forms of energy and projectile weaponry. It represents the pinnacle of Xylosian defensive technology." Chen, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the security breach she had accidentally engineered and the absurdity of the situation, muttered under her breath, more to herself than anyone, "Well, this escalated quickly." The Xylosian engineer stopped its presentation. It turned its head, a gesture of curiosity. "Clarify, escalated. Does this term indicate a positive vertical trajectory? Your statement is logged as enthusiastic approval of the project's rapid developmental progress." Chen simply blinked, then offered a slow nod. Yes, it does. We are tremendously impressed." The engineer clicked with satisfaction, recording her praise for its performance review. In that moment, Chen understood the sheer, untapped power of what she had stumbled upon. Sarcasm and ironic understatement weren't just humor. They were a perfect cloaking device for human intention. The Xylosians, for all their advanced technology, could not decode the disconnect between her words and their true meaning. Her throwaway comment was taken as a sincere request. Her expression of being overwhelmed was interpreted as glowing endorsement. The very ambiguity that defined sarcasm created a blind spot in their perception, a perfect smokescreen of misdirection. They were so busy taking everything she said at absolute face value that they never thought to question what she might actually be thinking, or more importantly, what her glasses were doing. She didn't have to spy. They simply handed her all their secrets, convinced she was their biggest fan. Back on Earth, the immense tactical value of this linguistic anomaly was not lost on military strategists. If a single diplomat's offhand remark could net the entire schematic of a top-tier alien armory, what could a properly trained and deployed force achieve? Thus began the most unconventional weapons development program in human history, spearheaded by a gruff, no-nonsense veteran who'd seen every kind of warfare imaginable, Sergeant Marcus Miller. His new assignment was to take raw recruits and forge them into the 1st Battalion of Verbal Warriors, a unit whose primary armament was their wit. The training facility was unlike any other. Instead of firing ranges and obstacle courses, cadets were confronted with immersive holographic simulations, dubbed verbal combat arenas. The objective was never to destroy the enemy, but to disable them through pure, unadulterated cognitive dissonance. Sergeant Miller would bellow at his bewildered trainees, "Forget your plasma rifles. Your mouth is your muzzle and sarcasm is your ammunition. A confused enemy is a neutralized enemy. Now make that overgrown toaster question its entire existence." One memorable simulation pitted a fresh-faced cadet against a holographic Vulpin drone. The Vulpin were a species of cold, hyper-efficient logic, their thought processes running on algorithms so rigid they could barely comprehend a rhetorical question, let alone irony. The drone advanced, its monotone voice issuing a standard surrender ultimatum. "Your biological resistance is statistically insignificant. Lay down your arms for processing." The cadet froze, panic setting in. From the observation deck, Miller's voice crackled over the comms, not with instruction, but with pure, inspired insult. "Tell that walking calculator its mother was a pocket protector." The cadet, grasping at the lifeline, stammered out the line. The effect was instantaneous and spectacular. The Vulpin drone stopped dead. Its optical sensors flickered. It processed the statement. Mother was a biological designation for a progenitor unit. Pocket protector was a terrestrial object designed to hold writing instruments. The two concepts were entirely incompatible, creating a logical paradox its systems could not resolve. The statement was not a truth, but it was not a direct falsehood either. It was an absurdity. Its processor's word, desperately trying to categorize the input into a binary true/false framework and failing catastrophically. With a pathetic fizzle of overloaded circuitry and a puff of digital smoke, the hologram short-circuited and winked out of existence. The simulation bay fell silent, save for the low hum of the projectors. The cadet stood there, stunned, having just defeated a superior foe not with violence, but with a perfectly crafted piece of nonsense. Sergeant Miller simply grunted, a rare smile touching his lips. See, plasma fire they can shield against, but insinuating its creator had poor organizational habits. That's an existential crisis they can't patch. This was the core of the training paradox. Humanity's most illogical and emotional form of communication was, against a universe of pure logic, our most potent and unpredictable weapon. We weren't just fighting aliens, we were crashing their operating systems with a well-timed joke. Of course, the true test of this new doctrine wasn't in a controlled simulation, but on the grandest stage of all, the Galactic Summit. This was where the most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy gathered to debate trade laws, territorial disputes, and existential threats. Humanity, the newest and perhaps most perplexing members, were viewed with a mixture of curiosity and deep suspicion. The other delegates, masters of solemn procedure and literal interpretation, were utterly unprepared for Ambassador Sean O'Reilly, a man whose greatest strength was his ability to deliver the most outrageous statements with the deadpan sincerity of a funeral director. The central agenda item was a proposal, heavily pushed by the stern and severe Grothnar Confederacy, for a universal disarmament treaty. They argued that humanity's recent, rapid militarization was a destabilizing force. The Grothnar ambassador, a hulking figure of granite-like flesh, concluded his lengthy, dour speech by fixing his gaze on O'Reilly. The path to peace is clear. The humans must decommission their fledgling fleet to prove their commitment to galactic harmony. The chamber fell silent. This was a direct and public challenge. The delegates from a dozen species watched, expecting a defensive retort, a legalistic counter-argument, or perhaps a withdrawn silence. O'Reilly slowly stood, adjusted his tie, and offered a warm, conciliatory smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Ambassador, you make a compelling case for universal peace, and you are absolutely right. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Had the humans capitulated so easily? O'Reilly continued, his tone dripping with earnest agreement. Of course, we'll agree to disarm immediately, right after you all learn to appreciate the nuanced beauty of interpretive dance. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible wink to the other human aides at his table. To the human ear, this was the most blatant sarcasm possible. It was a polite way of saying, we'll do that when hell freezes over. But in the hallowed halls of the summit, his statement was a seismic event. The Grothnar ambassador blinked, his stony face a mask of utter confusion. The Threlian delegates, a species of avian scholars, began frantically consulting their datapads for the definition of interpretive dance. The serpentine Xylosian representative, having learned nothing from the Lena Chen incident, leaned over to its aide and whispered, "Is this a new human ritual for sealing diplomatic agreements? We must research this dance at once." What followed was 3 hours of the most painstaking, bizarre, and utterly serious debate the summit had ever witnessed. The Grothnar insisted that the statement was a conditional acceptance and that the condition, their cultural appreciation of dance, must be met. The Threllians formed a subcommittee to analyze the historical and political significance of human movement-based art, postulating that it might be a metaphor for military strategy. The Xylosians proposed an amendment to the treaty that would include a mandatory cultural exchange program focused on Terpsichorean arts. They were all trying to decode a statement that had no code. It was just a joke. While the council descended into a logical rabbit hole of its own making, the real work began. The human delegation, feigning equal parts boredom and respectful attention to the proceedings, became a whirlwind of quiet activity. Aides who seemed to be taking copious notes were actually coordinating via subdermal microcomms. The janitorial bot servicing the hydration dispensers, its programming subtly altered, extended a cleaning appendage to place a microscopic audio sensor behind a light fixture. A diplomatic aide, accidentally spilling a drink near the Grothnar delegation seats, used the distraction to press a wafer-thin device underneath the table edge. The entire chamber, the very heart of galactic power, was being wired for sound under the noses of its guardians, all because they were too busy seriously debating the merits of the waltz versus the foxtrot as a precondition for peace. O'Reilly's sarcasm hadn't just deflected an aggressive demand, it had created the perfect smokescreen, a cloud of pure misdirection so dense that the most advanced security AIs in the galaxy were completely blind to the espionage happening in plain sight. Of course, the ultimate validation of this unconventional warfare came not in the halls of power, but in the stark, cold confines of a Grothnar detention facility. The Grothnar, with their rigid, militaristic mindset, believed they understood captivity and interrogation. They employed advanced neural scanners, psychological pressure, and the ever-present threat of brute force. What they had no defense against was a prisoner who refused to treat the situation with the grim seriousness they demanded. Chief Engineer Mateo Rodriguez, captured during a skirmish near a neutral zone, became their most frustrating and bewildering captive. The Grothnar interrogator, a hulking brute whose vocal cords sounded like grinding gravel, leaned over the restrained engineer. "Your vessel's core is unstable. You will provide the deactivation code for the self-destruct fail-safe." Rodriguez, who had been calmly assessing the room's ventilation system, sighed as if deeply inconvenienced. "Oh, yeah, it's a real pain. Safety protocols, you know how it is." The Grothnar commander slammed a massive fist on the table. "The code now." Rodriguez nodded slowly, a look of mock concentration on his face. Right. Okay, don't tell anyone this. It's kind of an industry secret." He leaned forward as far as his restraints would allow, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "You have to sing, specifically show tunes. The activation and deactivation sequence is voice locked to a medley from a 20th century musical called The Music Man. Start with 76 trombones, then pivot to Till There Was You for the bridge. The final confirmation note has to be a perfect B-flat on a Got Trouble, right here in River City." The Grothnar interrogator stared, his monolithic face a sculpture of pure, uncomprehending silence. His subordinate officers exchanged confused glances. This was not in any tactical manual. This defied all logical parameters of weapons design. It was insanity. And yet, the human said it with such flawless, weary sincerity, such a tone of professional annoyance at a silly corporate mandate, that the possibility of it being a lie never even occurred to them. To the Grothnar mind, a statement this specific and delivered with such straight-faced assurance couldn't possibly be invented on the spot. It had to be the bizarre, illogical truth of human engineering. A tense, silent debate passed between the Grothnar officers. Finally, the interrogator gestured to a junior technician. "Compliance, initiate the vocal sequence." What followed was the most surreal moment in Grothnar military history. The technician, his voice a low, tuneless rumble, began attempting to replicate the specified melodies from the data file they'd hastily pulled. The sounds that emerged were less a Broadway revival and more like a rock slide in a minor key, but the ship's sensitive audio receptors, programmed for the precise command, interpreted the garbled, off-key attempt as the correct sequence. A blaring, catastrophic alarm immediately erupted through the entire compound. Red lights strobed as automated systems screamed that the central reactor was undergoing a forced deactivation, a protocol that sounded exactly like a catastrophic meltdown. Panic was instantaneous and absolute. Bulkheads slammed shut. Grothnar guards abandoned their posts, scrambling for emergency stations. In the chaos, the power to the magnetic restraints in the interrogation room flickered and died. Rodriguez, free from his bonds, didn't sprint or fight. He simply stood up, stretched his shoulders with a quiet groan, and walked calmly to the now unlocked door. As he slipped into the chaotic hallway, filled with roaring Grothnar running in the opposite direction, he glanced back at the bewildered interrogator still trying to shout over the alarm. He offered a slight, almost imperceptible shrug and muttered to himself, a quiet testament to the entire human condition. Never underestimate a species that invented sarcasm. His escape wasn't a violent breakout. It was a walk of shame for his captors, a masterpiece of psychological manipulation where the only weapon fired was a perfectly delivered, absolutely absurd lie. Of course, the ultimate proving ground for humanity's unconventional arsenal wasn't a diplomatic summit or an interrogation cell, but the cold, unforgiving void of a battlefield. It was at the pivotal Battle of Tau Ceti that the strategic application of sarcasm evolved from a clever tactic into a full-scale doctrine of war, a moment where a single, perfectly cynical sentence altered the fate of an entire star system. The Terran Third Fleet, led by Commander Evelyn Wright, was hopelessly outmatched. Facing them was the Grothnar Armada, a wall of gleaming, hostile metal that outnumbered them 10-1. Standard military doctrine offered no solutions. A direct fight was suicide, and a retreat would leave a key human colony utterly exposed. The Grothnar expected one of those two responses: heroic, futile resistance or cowardly flight. Commander Wright gave them a third option they couldn't possibly have anticipated: sarcastic surrender. As the Grothnar fleet moved into a classic envelopment pattern, their flagship hailing the human vessels with the standard demand for unconditional submission, Wright opened a channel. But she didn't broadcast on the standard command frequency. She blasted her message across every channel: open civilian bands, emergency frequencies, even low-power intra-ship maintenance comms. And her tone wasn't one of despair or defiance. It was the weary, almost bored resignation of a retail worker at the end of a long shift. "All right, you win," she stated, her voice flat. "We surrender. Please send your least competent soldiers to collect our weapons. We'd rather not be accidentally vaporized by someone who actually knows what they're doing." On the bridge of the Grothnar command ship, the lead warmaster froze. His tactical officers stared at their consoles, then at each other. The statement was parsed, analyzed, and reanalyzed. The surrender itself was clear and within expected parameters, but the condition, it was illogical. It was an insult wrapped in a request. The warmaster's first instinct was fury, a desire to simply obliterate the impertinent humans. But a colder, more calculating part of his mind, trained in the absolute literal interpretation of all commands, took over. The enemy had surrendered. They had made a request as part of their terms of surrender. To ignore a specific, stated term of surrender would be a breach of galactic conventions of war, something the Grothnar prided themselves on. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. More importantly, complying would be the ultimate show of strength, a demonstration that they were so confident, so utterly in control, that they could afford to indulge the pathetic, bizarre whims of a defeated foe. A command was issued. Across the Grothnar fleet, the elite marine boarding parties who were poised to storm the human ships were ordered to stand down. Instead, the order went out to the support vessels, dispatch the maintenance and custodial crews. These were the Grothnar equivalent of janitors and mechanics, beings trained to fix plumbing and scrub decks, not conduct hostile takeovers of warships. Dozens of unarmed utility shuttles, loaded with confused workers carrying toolkits instead of blasters, began to drift across the void toward the seemingly docile human fleet. This created a cascading failure in the Grothnar battle formation. To protect these vulnerable, slow-moving shuttles, the Grothnar capital ships had to adjust their positions, creating a shield around them. This meticulous, rigid formation suddenly developed a soft, pulsing heart of utter vulnerability, a perfect corridor of chaos right through the center of their armada. They had focused so intently on the literal meaning of Wright's words, the surrender and the bizarre request, that they completely missed the strategic reality. They were looking at the text and ignoring the subtext. Commander Wright watched the tactical display with a predator's calm. The gap was forming exactly where her chief tactical officer had predicted. "All batteries focus fire on coordinates 729er, she said, her voice now sharp and clear of all pretended weariness. "Helm, flank speed, take us right through their welcoming committee." The Terran Third Fleet, which had been playing dead, erupted into motion. Every weapon they had left was unleashed not on the battleships but on the escorts guarding the shuttle corridor. The Grothnar, expecting to receive prisoners, were completely unprepared for a targeted, surgical strike. Their formations shattered from the inside out as human ships slammed through the gap, their attack runs unchallenged because the Grothnar ships were too busy trying to avoid hitting their own unarmed maintenance shuttles. The tide of the battle turned in minutes. The Grothnar command structure, built on unwavering adherence to logic and order, was thrown into disarray by an attack that made no tactical sense according to their manuals. The Battle of Tau Ceti wasn't won by superior firepower, it was won by superior psychology. It was a victory secured not through strength, but through the deliberate and weaponized exploitation of a cultural blind spot. Commander Wright hadn't just outfought the Grothnar, she had outthought them by using a form of communication they lacked the framework to even recognize, proving that in the vast, silent theater of war, the most devastating projectile isn't always a plasma bolt. Sometimes it's a perfectly delivered, brilliantly cynical idea. Yet for all its battlefield successes, the true mechanism behind humanity's linguistic weapon remained a mystery even to us. We knew it worked, but we didn't fully understand why it was so devastatingly effective against such advanced intellects. The breakthrough didn't come from a general or a diplomat, but from a quiet, unassuming linguist named Dr. Anya Patel, who stumbled upon the answer while studying intercepted Grothnar communications. Her discovery would reveal that our advantage wasn't just psychological. It was fundamentally structural, buried in the very architecture of language itself. Dr. Patel was analyzing a routine Grothnar tactical report, a dry document detailing the structural integrity of their forward outposts. The report was filled with absolute concrete statements. The outer wall is 12.4 meters thick. The shield generator operates at 97% efficiency. As she worked, she absent-mindedly muttered to her assistant, a phrase any human would understand instantly. "Right, and our defenses are practically made of papier-mâché in comparison." It was a classic piece of professional sarcasm, a way to vent frustration through hyperbolic understatement. Her assistant chuckled and got back to work. But the room's universal translator, a powerful device constantly scanning and parsing all linguistic input, did something extraordinary. It flagged Dr. Patel's comment as a high-priority tactical update and, following its standard protocol, automatically uploaded the data to the fleet's shared intelligence network. This single, automated error created a cascade of consequences. The phrase "made of paper" was intercepted by a Grothnar spy probe monitoring human comms. To their hyper-literal analytical engines, this wasn't an idiom or a joke. It was a factual declaration of a critical vulnerability. The report was rushed to a Grothnar strike commander who saw not a human expressing weariness but a golden opportunity. He immediately diverted a wing of heavy bombers from their primary target, a heavily fortified Terran starbase, to a cluster of seemingly unimportant remote sensor outposts that the human report had just identified as critically weak. The Grothnar bombers screamed in, unleashing their entire payload of high-yield plasma bombs on the flimsy, unmanned sensor towers. The resulting fireball was spectacular, a brilliant but ultimately pointless display of raw power against targets of negligible value. As the Grothnar commander confidently reported the successful destruction of the paper-thin human defenses, the real Terran fleet, alerted by the sudden and bizarre shift in the enemy's strategy, moved into position. With the Grothnar bombers now out of ammunition and out of position, the human admiral launched a counter-offensive against the now undefended starbase, achieving a total victory with minimal losses. The Grothnar had been tricked into disarming themselves not by a deliberate lie, but by a literal interpretation of a sarcastic remark. "Back in her lab, Doctor." Patel was initially horrified when she traced the tactical disaster back to her offhand comment, but her horror quickly turned to rapt fascination. She delved into the data, comparing hundreds of hours of human and alien communications. Her resulting report, The Literal Gap: Sarcasm as an Unbreachable Cryptographic System, became one of the most important documents in human military history. She proved that most advanced alien languages, including the Grothnars, were built on a framework of absolute precision. Every word had a single, defined meaning. Context was used for clarification, not for contradiction. Their languages lacked the crucial tonal and syntactic markers that allow a human listener to understand that the words "great job" can mean "well done" or "you have utterly failed us," depending on the speaker's inflection and the situation. For these species, the concept of saying the exact opposite of what you mean to emphasize your true point was not just foreign. It was a logical impossibility, a catastrophic system error. Sarcasm to them wasn't a form of communication, it was noise. It was data so corrupted it couldn't be processed. When a human says, "Our defenses are paper," our brains automatically apply the sarcasm filter, interpreting it as "our defenses are strong." An alien AI lacking that filter accepts the statement at face value. Dr. Patel's work showed that we weren't just mocking our enemies, we were broadcasting on a frequency they were physically incapable of decrypting correctly. Our most common form of humor was in effect a perfect, unbreakable code. We had been speaking in ciphers our entire existence, and we never even knew it until we met a species that took every word we said at face value. Of course, the application of this linguistic weapon extended far beyond the battlefield and into the cutthroat arenas of commerce and diplomacy, where a different kind of predator roamed, the mercantile guild of Xylos Prime. If the Grothnar were warriors of stone and fury, the guild was a hydra of avarice and contract law. Their entire culture was predicated on the art of the deal, and they believed they had perfected it over millennia. Their negotiations were legendary, a complex dance of escalating demands and feigned disinterest designed to systematically dismantle an opponent's position and extract every last credit of value. They came to Earth not as conquerors but as exploiters, expecting to find a naive, upstart species ripe for economic plundering. They were utterly unprepared for trade. Representative Alastair Jenkins, a man who understood that the best way to win a game of chess is to enthusiastically offer your opponent all your pieces. The guild's lead negotiator, a sleek, calculating being named Vorlag, began the proceedings with a display of overwhelming, almost predatory generosity. He laid out the proposed trade agreement, a document so thick with clauses and subclauses it could have been used as a structural support beam. The terms were, as expected, brutally one-sided. It granted the Guild exclusive mining rights to entire asteroid belts, imposed crippling tariffs on human goods, and even included a quaint little addendum that would have given them naming rights to Earth's moon for promotional purposes. Vorlag sat back, a smug, satisfied gleam in his multifaceted eyes, expecting the humans to recoil in horror and begin the tedious process of whittling down his demands. This was the dance, this was what he lived for. Jenkins, however, did not even flinch. He listened intently, his face a mask of growing, rapturous admiration. When Vorlag finished, Jenkins slowly placed his hands on the table, his eyes wide with what could only be described as profound reverence. Magnificent, he breathed, the word full of genuine-sounding awe. Just masterful, Vorlag's smugness flickered, replaced by a sliver of confusion. This was not part of the script, Jenkins continued, his voice swelling with excitement. These terms, the sheer, unadulterated ruthlessness of them, the bold-faced audacity, we've been trying to get someone to offer us a deal this spectacularly bad for years. He picked up the datapad containing the agreement as if it were a holy text. You see, Counselor Vorlag, your intelligence is good, but perhaps not complete. You've discovered our mineral wealth, but you've missed our true national passion, humiliation. Jenkins leaned forward, his tone becoming conspiratorial, as if letting Vorlag in on a huge secret. We have a saying on Earth, it's not a good deal unless you're crying yourself to sleep afterward. It's a point of cultural pride. We measure a negotiator's skill not by how much they gain, but by how much they spectacularly lose. My predecessors will be so jealous. To be on the receiving end of such a devastating, historically terrible agreement, it's the highest honor you could have bestowed upon us, we accept. No changes, we want your worst. The silence in the room was absolute. Vorlag and his entire delegation were frozen. Their hyper-logical, profit-driven minds scrambled to process this information. Every cue from Jenkins, his tone, his body language, his apparent enthusiasm screamed sincerity, but the content of his words was a logical black hole. They could not compute a species that derived pleasure from economic masochism. To agree so readily was an act of such profound irrationality that it completely short-circuited their carefully rehearsed negotiation strategy. Their entire framework was built on the assumption that the other party wanted to win. Jenkins was proudly, passionately announcing that he wanted to lose, and to lose in the most grand and glorious fashion possible. This created a catastrophic crisis of purpose for the Mercantile Guild. If the humans wanted a terrible deal, then by the Guild's own ruthless logic, giving them one was not a victory, it was cooperation. It was fulfilling their opponent's desire. To truly win, to truly dominate and prove their superiority, they would have to do the one thing their nature rebelled against. They would have to offer a good deal. They would have to thwart the human stated desire for humiliation. The thought was physically painful to them, but the alternative, allowing this upstart species to achieve its bizarre cultural goal, was an even greater insult to their mercantile pride. Vorlag slowly reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and pulled the datapad back. A moment, he said, his voice uncharacteristically strained. There appears to have been a miscalculation. What followed was the most surreal 30 minutes in Mercantile Guild history. The Xylosians huddled together, arguing in frantic, hushed clicks and whistles. They began furiously redlining their own agreement, not to make it better for themselves, but to make it better for humanity. They slashed their own tariffs, reduced their mining claims, and threw in favorable shipping rates, all in a desperate, illogical attempt to spite the humans by giving them a good deal. They were so determined to deny Jenkins his sought-after humiliation that they negotiated against their own interests with a fervor they usually reserved for bankrupting competitors. The final agreement they shoved back across the table was, by any objective measure, the single most advantageous trade deal humanity had ever signed. Jenkins looked it over, his face falling into a perfect mask of profound disappointment. "Oh," he said, sighing with genuine-sounding dejection. "Well, if you insist," he signed with a flourish that conveyed the deepest resignation. As the relieved Xylosians gathered their things, believing they had finally, paradoxically, won by losing, Jenkins allowed himself a small, private smile. The Mercantile Guild had come to play chess, and he had won by convincing them the goal was to lose all your pieces as fast as possible. They never realized the entire game had been a bluff within a bluff, all built on a foundation of humor they could not begin to comprehend. This bizarre and almost supernatural effectiveness of our linguistic camouflage was perhaps most perfectly demonstrated not in a grand fleet action or a high-stakes negotiation, but in a silent, solo infiltration mission that should have been impossible. The target was the central data nexus of the Grothnar homeworld, a fortress so secure its architects believed it could only be breached by a being made of pure, coherent light. The security was a multi-layered nightmare of motion sensors, genetic sniffers, and autonomous drone patrols programmed with one singular, overriding directive: detect and eliminate any non-Grothnar biological signature. The entire system was a monument to paranoid efficiency, and it had one critical, hilarious blind spot. It could process a lie, but it could not process a joke. Agent Carter, a man whose resting heart rate was lower than most people's while asleep, found himself cornered in a sterile white hallway. The soft hum of a patrol drone grew louder, its sleek, polished form rounding the corner and blocking his path. A crimson sensor beam washed over him, analyzing, comparing, rejecting. A synthesized voice, cold and devoid of inflection, echoed in the confined space. "Alert, unidentified biological entity detected. Species, human. State your purpose or be neutralized." Every alarm in Carter's training should have been screaming. He was caught. The mission was a failure, but Carter saw past the immediate threat to the deeper programming of his enemy. The drone wasn't asking for his identification, it was presenting a binary choice. It had already categorized him as a human. The only acceptable answer that wouldn't result in immediate disintegration was proof that its initial categorization was wrong. He couldn't lie and say he was a Grothnar maintenance worker. His biology would give him away instantly, so he chose the one answer that was so absurd, so utterly illogical, that it bypassed the drone's threat assessment protocols entirely and crashed directly into its fundamental truth verification subroutine. He didn't break stride, he didn't change his expression. In the same flat, bored tone one might use to state the time, he replied, "Scan error, I am not a human. I am a very sophisticated toaster." He even managed to inject a hint of mechanical annoyance into his delivery, as if this was a tedious, recurring glitch he had to correct all the time. The drone froze. Its sensor beam remained fixed on him, flickering slightly as its processors attempted to reconcile the data. Its optical sensors saw a humanoid form. Its biochemical analyzers detected human DNA, but its audio receptors had just received a verbal statement that directly contradicted all that physical evidence. The statement was delivered not with the panic of an infiltrator, but with the dull certainty of a simple machine stating its function. The drone's programming, built on a foundation of absolute literalism, was faced with an impossible equation. Both inputs could not be correct. Either its advanced multi-spectrum scanners were malfunctioning, or the entity was telling the truth. A low-pitched whirring sound emanated from the drone as it prioritized the verbal input. The concept of a toaster was in its database a simple human appliance for browning sliced bread. The concept of a sophisticated toaster created a logical fork. It began running a new analysis not for human life signs but for metallic composition, power signatures, and evidence of heating elements. Finding none, it should have defaulted to its primary directive. But Carter's performance was too perfect. His utter lack of concern sold the fiction. The drone, unable to resolve the paradox, did the only thing its crisis management protocol allowed. It escalated the query. It remained stationary, its internal comms buzzing as it uploaded the sensor data and the audio recording to its central processing hub for a higher authority to adjudicate. Its simple mind now utterly consumed by the philosophical and mechanical implications of a bipedal talking toaster. Carter didn't wait for a verdict. While the drone was mentally debating appliance sentience and the definition of sophistication, he simply stepped around it and continued his walk down the hallway, disappearing into the heart of the most secure facility on the planet. Behind him, he left a growing network of confusion. The initial drone's query sparked a heated, entirely serious debate among the security AI nodes. One faction argued that the scanners were faulty and the statement was factual. Another posited that this was a new, terrifyingly advanced form of human android, requiring a full category update to their threat database. A third, more philosophical subroutine began drafting a 70-page thesis on the ethical treatment of potentially sentient kitchenware. The entire security apparatus, a system designed to stop armies, was completely derailed by a single sentence of sublime nonsense. Agent Carter didn't hack the system. He confused it into a temporary standstill, proving that sometimes the best way to become invisible is not to hide what you are, but to proudly and very convincingly claim to be something completely ridiculous. Of course, this strategic advantage wasn't simply left to chance or the quick wits of individual commanders. The staggering success of these linguistic operations demanded a formal, dedicated branch of the military, and thus the Psychological Warfare Division's Sarcastic Operations Group was born. Headed by the brilliantly dry and perpetually unimpressed Major Evelyn Thompson, this unit didn't field soldiers in the traditional sense. Its operatives were masters of linguistics, cultural studies, and comedic timing, housed in a secure bunker filled not with ammunition, but with banks of hyper-advanced communication equipment and cultural databases. Their mission was singular: to weaponize wit on a strategic scale and systematically dismantle enemy command structures without firing a single shot. The process was both an art and a science. Before any engagement, Thompson's team would spend hours, sometimes days, poring over intercepted enemy communications. They weren't just looking for tactical data. They were building psychological profiles, searching for cultural pressure points, personal insecurities, and professional pride. They needed to understand what an enemy commander valued most so they could craft the perfect verbal jab to undermine it. For the Groth-Nar, a species that prized rigid discipline and flawless order above all else, the most devastating attacks weren't about their mothers or their intelligence, they were about their competence. A well-placed comment about the neatness of their formation or the textbook nature of their strategy wasn't a compliment. It was the ultimate insult, implying a lack of creativity and individual brilliance. Once the battle commenced, Thompson's team would spring into action. Using powerful directed broadcast arrays, they would hijack the enemy fleet's command and control channels, overriding their communications with a calm, clear, and utterly mocking human voice. Imagine the scene aboard a Groth-Nar flagship. The War Master is issuing precise orders, his bridge crew operating with machine-like efficiency, when a new, unfamiliar voice cuts smoothly across the channel. "Attention, Groth-Nar Formation Delta 9, the voice might say, its tone that of a mildly interested sports commentator. We're just admiring your textbook perfect echelon right formation from up here. It's very symmetrical. Did you all practice that in the mirror this morning? Looks like a real team-building exercise." The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. On the human side, it was a morale booster, a moment of shared levity in the tension of combat. On the Groth-Nar side, it was psychological poison. The War Master, conditioned to expect either respectful silence or screaming defiance from his foes, would be confronted with something his brain could not categorize: casual, condescending mockery. His first reaction was often a sputtering, incoherent rage. He would demand his communications officers trace and silence the transmission, diverting valuable resources and attention from the actual battle. But Thompson's team used sophisticated bouncing algorithms, making the signal impossible to pinpoint. The voice would simply return, a ghost in the machine, always calm, always cutting. Oh, and that weapon's discharge was very impressive. A little to the left, though. You nearly hit that completely empty patch of space. Bold choice. This sustained sarcastic bombardment, as it was officially termed, preyed on the very emotions the Grothnar military sought to suppress: pride, anger, and insecurity. A commander who believed himself to be a consummate professional couldn't abide being treated like a novice. He would begin making aggressive, emotional decisions to prove his prowess, abandoning careful strategies for flashy, high-risk maneuvers designed to show the humans. He would order fleets to break formation to chase phantom targets hinted at in the taunts, or focus overwhelming firepower on insignificant targets just to demonstrate his fleet's power. The careful, logical dance of space combat dissolved into a chaotic, emotional brawl where the Grothnar's greatest strength, their discipline, became their greatest weakness. Post-battle analysis across dozens of engagements revealed a stunning and consistent statistic. Enemy forces subjected to Major Thompson's broadcast protocol showed a 40% increase in tactical errors, coordination failures, and reckless decisions. They were literally being taunted into defeat, their command structure unraveling one sarcastic comment at a time. The battlefield had expanded beyond the physical. It now included the very airwaves, and humanity held a monopoly on the most devastating weapon in that new theater: the perfectly timed, psychologically calibrated joke. While the Psychological Warfare Division was perfecting the art of the strategic taunt, the individual human capacity for deadpan deception was being tested in far more dire circumstances: the interrogation chamber. The Viridian Collective, a species of meticulous archivists and obsessive analysts, believed that truth was a simple equation to be solved. Their methods of extracting information were terrifyingly effective against most species, relying on advanced neuroscanners that could detect the slightest synaptic flare of a lie. They were utterly unprepared for a prisoner like Agent Kaito Williams, a man who understood that the most perfect lie is one wrapped in a kernel of mundane, boring truth. Captured during a reconnaissance mission gone wrong, Williams found himself in a sterile, white room, held in a force-restraint chair while a Viridian Inquisitor, its form a shifting cloud of crystalline particles, hovered before him. The neuroscanner glowed ominously by his temple. "Your species possesses a strategic advantage we cannot quantify," the Inquisitor hissed, its voice like grinding glass. "You will disclose the nature of this sarcasm weapon immediately." Williams knew the scanner would detect any outright fabrication. He couldn't simply deny its existence. So he gave them exactly what they asked for, just not in the way they expected. He leaned forward as if sharing a grave state secret, his face a mask of weary solemnity. "You found us out," he confessed, his voice low and resigned. "It's the water." The Inquisitor's particles shimmered with intense focus. "Elaborate." Williams sighed, the picture of a defeated man revealing his greatest shame. "There's a spring in a small, remote territory called Florida. The water possesses unique electrochemical properties that enhance neural plasticity. It allows for the cognitive dissonance required for advanced sarcastic computation. It's not a weapon you build, it's a resource you drink." To sell the lie, he wove in just enough real, verifiable data. He gave them the actual chemical composition of the local aquifer water from the region, a mix of minerals and trace elements that was bizarrely complex but completely ordinary. He described the bottling facility down to the correct brand of conveyor belt lubricant they used, details the Viridians could cross-reference with their intelligence databases and find were perfectly accurate. The lie wasn't in the facts, but in the grand, absurd conclusion he built upon them. The Viridian Inquisitor processed this information. The neuroscanner remained silent. Everything Williams said was, on a factual level, true. The water existed, the chemical composition was correct, the bottling plant was a real facility. The Inquisitor's analytical mind, so used to parsing data, could not detect the sarcastic frame surrounding it. It saw only a cascade of verified facts leading to an inevitable, shocking conclusion. The report that went up the chain of command was a masterpiece of misdirection. It stated with absolute certainty that humanity's advantage was not technological or biological, but geological. It was a natural resource. What followed was the most colossal strategic wild goose chase in Viridian military history. Entire fleets meant to be pressing the attack against a reeling human defense were suddenly rerouted. Their new mission: locate and secure the planetary coordinates for this mythical hydrological goldmine. Invasion plans were shelved, tactical assaults were put on hold. The Viridian war machine, a beacon of cold efficiency, became obsessed with finding a single water source on a planet covered in them. Intelligence assets were wasted analyzing satellite imagery of every supermarket distribution center on the eastern seaboard. Special forces teams were dropped into humid Florida swamps, not to sabotage military installations, but to take clandestine samples from artesian wells and municipal water treatment plants, desperately trying to isolate the non-existent sarcasm isotope. Back in his cell, Williams listened to the gradual shift in the station's activity. The constant march of guards outside his door lessened. The urgent chatter over the comms systems changed from tactical updates to frustrated geological surveys. He allowed himself a small, private smile. He had bought the one thing humanity needed most: time. While the Viridians were chasing waterfalls, human command was using the unexpected respite to regroup shattered fleets, reinforce battered defensive lines, and shore up the very sectors the Viridians should have been crushing. The greatest intelligence coup of the war wasn't stealing the enemy's plans. It was convincing the enemy to abandon their perfectly good plans to go on a snipe hunt for a bottle of water. Agent Williams hadn't just lied to his captors, he had weaponized their own literalism, their unwavering trust in data, and turned it into the anchor that stalled their entire war effort. But the true masterstroke of our linguistic warfare program wasn't a broadcast or a personal deception. It was a piece of celestial graffiti that turned a simple rock into a psychological smart bomb. The project, officially designated Operation Backhanded Comet, was the brainchild of a particularly mischievous team of engineers and astrophysicists who realized that space itself could be their canvas for sarcasm. Their target was the JELT communication network, a series of sophisticated relay stations that allowed the JELT High Command to coordinate their fleets with flawless, instantaneous precision. The JELT were a species of immense pride, their culture built on a foundation of perceived intellectual and tactical superiority. To merely jam their signals would be temporary. To insult their chain of command using their own hardware would be legendary. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. A small nickel-iron asteroid was identified on a long-period orbit that would bring it passing through a dense cluster of JELT comms arrays. Human tugs intercepted it, and teams of engineers descended upon the ancient rock. They didn't attach warheads or sophisticated jammers. Instead, they used industrial lasers to etch a single, sprawling sentence deep into the asteroid's metallic crust in flawless Jeltian script. The message read, "This space rock has better tactical awareness than your admiral." They then attached a simple, low-power beacon to the asteroid, programmed to activate and broadcast that same message on all standard JELT frequencies as soon as it entered the target zone. Their work done, the engineers nudged the asteroid back onto its course, a silent, spinning cannonball of pure, concentrated mockery hurtling through the void. Weeks later, the asteroid, now dubbed the Trojan Insult, drifted into the heart of JELT communication space. The beacon flared to life, and the message began to ping across every channel, from encrypted military bands to civilian traffic control. On the bridge of a Gelt command ship, the initial reaction was one of pure, unadulterated confusion. The communications officer assumed it was a sensor ghost or a piece of corrupted data. But the message was clear, repeating, and grammatically perfect. It was also a logical impossibility. An inanimate object could not possess tactical awareness, and to compare one favorably to a revered fleet admiral was not just an insult. It was a profound category error that struck at the very core of Geltian logic. The Gelt systems, designed to pass tactical data and strategic reports, did what they were built to do. They analyzed the message. Their translation AIs, some of the most advanced in the galaxy, tore the sentence apart. They searched for coded meanings in the syntax, for hidden frequencies in the carrier wave, for any possible strategic value in the statement. Was Space Rock a code name for a new human ship? Was tactical awareness a reference to a specific sensor technology they had missed? The sheer computational power devoted to deconstructing this one piece of interstellar trash talk was staggering. The array's processing nodes began to overheat under the strain, their capacity overwhelmed by the futile task of trying to find strategic depth in a well-crafted insult. This created the critical window human electronic warfare specialists were waiting for. With the Gelt communications net distracted, its processing power tied up in a philosophical debate over an insult, the human fleet launched its true attack. A wave of targeted cyber warfare protocols, which would have normally been identified and neutralized instantly, slipped through the suddenly porous electronic defenses. They flooded the distracted networks not with more noise, but with silent, surgical viruses that targeted power distribution and targeting systems. By the time the Gelt admirals realized the asteroid's message was just a joke, a concept they still struggled to grasp, their defensive grid was already compromised, their weapons systems were cycling through pointless diagnostic reboots, and their sensor coverage was filled with ghosts. The humans hadn't just won a battle, they had demonstrated a terrifying new form of dominance. They had so thoroughly mastered the art of information warfare that they could use a literal rock to deliver a knockout punch, proving that in the human arsenal, even a chunk of cosmic debris could be loaded, aimed, and fired as a psychological weapon. Naturally, this consistent and bewildering success could not go unnoticed at the highest levels of interstellar governance. The Galactic Federation, a sprawling bureaucracy dedicated to maintaining a semblance of order, was compelled to investigate. How was this one species, so new to the galactic stage, achieving such disproportionate results in the fields of counterintelligence and psychological operations? The inquiry was led by a multi-species review board, a collection of the most logical, literal-minded, and serious beings from a dozen different cultures. They expected to uncover a secret technology, a genetic mutation, or perhaps a hidden well of psionic power. They did not expect to be sitting across a table from a grizzled, retired Terran general named Elias Norris, who seemed to view the entire proceeding with an air of wry amusement. The lead inquisitor, a being of shimmering energy who identified as a consensus of pure data, began the proceedings. The records indicate a statistical anomaly in Terran operational efficacy that defies all predictive models. Your agents consistently bypass security protocols rated for intelligence quotients exceeding 200. Your diplomats secure concessions that violate 17 established principles of interstellar negotiation. Our analysis concludes this is either a systemic data error or a conscious act of deception. You will explain this discrepancy. General Norris leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. He took a long, slow sip of water, letting the tension in the room build. He wasn't stalling, he was setting the stage. "All right," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'll give you the answer, but you're not going to like it." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his expression utterly serious. "It's because we've been training for this since we were children. Our entire culture is a preparatory academy for advanced psychological operations. The cornerstone of our training, the foundational drill we all undergo for decades, is how to tell our parents we love them by saying the exact opposite. The review board was silent. The various translators worked furiously, their lights flickering as they attempted to pass the statement. The consensus of pure data pulsed with a soft, confused light. Clarify, you express affection through negation. This is a logical paradox. Norris nodded gravely. It's our most vital survival skill. Imagine a young human, approximately 14 Earth years old. Their primary caregiver, usually the maternal unit, enters their personal sanctum and observes a state of profound disorder. The correct, expected response from the offspring is an apology and immediate remediation. The advanced, high-level Terran response is to look their creator in the eye and with a tone of absolute sincerity say, "Yeah, I was just going for the authentic natural disaster look." Do you think the museum will want to curate it? Norris paused, letting the translators catch up. The subtext, which every human instantly understands, is a complex negotiation for autonomy, a declaration of individuality, and yes, an expression of deep familial bond through shared humor. The parent understands the message is, "I feel comfortable enough with you to be ridiculous, and I know you love me anyway." It is a high-stakes game of emotional chess played with a smirk. He continued, painting a picture of a planet-wide boot camp in irony. A parent might say, "If your friends jumped off a cliff, would you do it too?" This is not a genuine inquiry into our risk assessment protocols. It is a sarcastic commentary on peer pressure. The skilled trainee's response is not no, but only if they landed in a really cool pile of leaves. This demonstrates an understanding of the underlying lesson while simultaneously asserting cognitive independence. We are not taught this in a classroom, we are immersed in it. Our advertising, our entertainment, our daily interactions, it's a constant, low-level simulation of verbal and cognitive ambiguity. You are not dealing with soldiers who learned sarcasm. You are dealing with sarcasm that learned to be soldiers. The review board was in a state of utter paralysis. The Valexian delegates' frills were vibrating with distress. The Grothnar observer was clenching and unclenching his stone fists, trying to fit the concept into a tactical framework and failing. The consensus of pure data simply flickered, its light dimming as it attempted to run a simulation of a human household based on these parameters. The model crashed almost immediately, overloaded by contradictory emotional data streams. In that moment, the board reached a unanimous, horrifying conclusion. General Norris was telling the truth. Humanity's advantage wasn't a piece of hardware or a pill. It was an entire intangible cultural ecosystem, a form of mental martial arts so ingrained it was as natural as breathing. They could not replicate it, they could not train for it, they could not even properly understand it. The only logical solution, the only way to manage a threat they could not comprehend, was to put the humans in charge of it. The official finding of the review board was a masterpiece of bureaucratic capitulation. It stated that due to the unique and non-replicable ontolinguistic paradigm inherent in Terran cognitive development, and after extensive analysis confirms the phenomenon presents a zero risk of proliferation to other member species, oversight of all Federation psychological operations and counterintelligence efforts would be permanently ceded to a new Terran-led office. General Norris accepted the directive with his signature deadpan delivery. "Well," he said, scanning the document, "this is a tremendous vote of confidence. We're all feeling very supported and not at all like you're making us the designated crazy ones." The board members, taking his words at face value, nodded in solemn agreement, satisfied they had successfully contained the problem by giving it absolute power. They never saw the slow smile that spread across the general's face as he left the chamber, having just won his species the keys to the kingdom without firing a shot, using nothing but the absolute, unvarnished truth. Of course, the weaponization of our unique communication style was never confined to military or diplomatic channels. It infiltrated the most well-intentioned avenues of interstellar cooperation, often with the most chaotic and unintended consequences. Take the case of the Plorians, a species whose entire culture was built upon the pillars of solemnity, meticulous ritual, and profound seriousness. They viewed existence as a series of sacred procedures to be mastered, and they extended this philosophy to their interstellar outreach programs, welcoming a handful of human exchange students with the gravitas of a state funeral. For a human like Leo Miller, a linguistics major with a deeply ingrained and utterly dry sense of humor, this environment was less a cultural immersion and more a comedic playground. His host family, the esteemed Clan Vitar, were paragons of Plorian virtue. They approached every action, from organizing their data crystals by emotional resonance to polishing the floor with sonic harmonizers, with a level of intense, unwavering focus that most humans reserve for brain surgery. Their magnum opus, the piece de resistance of their cultural identity, was the grand ceremonial tea preparation. This was not a simple matter of boiling water and adding leaves. It was a 17-hour marathon of precision, involving the calibrated humming of specific notes to agitate the water molecules, the exact angle of sunlight through a crystalline prism to steep the leaves, and the rhythmic tapping of ceremonial spoons to align the beverage emotional frequency. For the Vitar family, this was the highest art form. For Leo Miller, after sitting through it for the third time, it was an exercise in endurance that left him physically aching from inactivity and mentally crafting the perfect, soul-crushing review. When the ritual finally concluded, and the elder Vitar presented him with a single, minuscule cup of what tasted like mildly flavored lukewarm water, they fixed him with their large, expectant eyes. They awaited his analysis, ready to record his profound thoughts in their family ledger. Leo, his back stiff and his mind numb, looked at the earnest faces around him. He didn't roll his eyes or sigh. Instead, he summoned every ounce of performative sincerity he possessed, leaned forward, and delivered the line with the heartfelt conviction of a man who had just witnessed the birth of a star. "This," he said, his voice quivering with manufactured awe, "this 17-hour ceremonial tea preparation is truly the highlight of my existence." The effect on the Vitar family was instantaneous and profound. Their postures straightened with pride, their skin, which normally had a muted gray hue, flushed with a pleased pink. They had been acknowledged, their life's work, their sacred tradition, had been validated by an off-worlder. They meticulously recorded his statement verbatim, noting his tone, his facial expression, and the specific phrasing. They took his sarcastic hyperbole as the highest, most genuine form of interstellar compliment. Unbeknownst to Leo, the Vitar family were minor cultural influences on Ploria, known for their pristine execution of traditional customs. They immediately published Leo's testimonial on the Planetary Cultural Network, presenting it as definitive proof that their ancient practices held universal appeal and profound significance, even to species from entirely different evolutionary backgrounds. The post went viral. Other Plorian families, desperate to appear equally sophisticated and to earn such glowing reviews from their own human guests, began to adopt the practice. What was once a niche ritual of a single family became a galaxy-wide trend. News segments showcased the human-approved tea ceremony. Corporations began selling certified ceremonial spoon sets and tuning forks guaranteed to hum at the correct frequency. A new entire branch of Plorian academia emerged, dedicated to the socio-emotional impact of specific water agitation frequencies. The ritual, already long, was further embellished with new, essential steps discovered through intense analysis of Leo's single comment. If the highlight of a being's existence was 17 hours, then surely 24 hours would be even more magnificent. The unintended side effect of this cultural tsunami was a catastrophic drain on Plorian military readiness. The Plorian Starfleet, renowned for its discipline and punctuality, found its operational capacity grinding to a halt. You cannot maintain a constant defensive patrol when your entire command staff, from the admirals down to the engineers, is obligated to spend a full Plorian cycle, roughly 32 human hours preparing a single cup of tea to demonstrate their cultural refinement. Battle drills were postponed, ship maintenance schedules were ignored, critical strategic meetings were delayed because a key officer was in the sunlight alignment phase and could not be disturbed. An entire civilization, famed for its efficiency, had accidentally bureaucratized itself into near paralysis by taking a homesick student's sarcastic quip as a sacred commandment. They had effectively been disarmed not by a bomb, but by a compliment, proving that the most dangerous thing a human can offer a hyper-literal species isn't a threat, but a perfectly delivered piece of insincere praise. While the Psychological Warfare Division was dismantling enemy command structures with broadcast taunts, a different branch of human research and development was taking the concept of weaponized wit in a far more literal and frankly absurd direction. Deep within a top-secret laboratory, a team of scientists and engineers who had clearly watched one too many old Earth cartoons was attempting to answer a question no one had ever seriously asked. Can you put sarcasm in a can? The project was born from a simple observation. Empathic species, those who could naturally sense and mirror the emotional states of others, were particularly vulnerable to human sarcasm. Where a logical species would experience confusion, an empathic one would experience the full, cringe-inducing force of the intended insult, feeling the speaker's contempt and derision as a wave of psychic feedback. This wasn't just a psychological discomfort. For some species, it was a physically painful experience. The project lead, a brilliant but eccentric doctor named Aris Thorne, saw not a curiosity but a blueprint. If a spoken insult could cause wincing, what could a concentrated, amplified dose of pure, undiluted sarcasm do? The result of their questionable genius was the prototype SN7, nicknamed the Snark Grenade by the lab techs. It looked, for all intents and purposes, like a standard-issue concussion grenade, a feature the developers insisted was crucial for tactical familiarity. But instead of an explosive charge, its core housed a powerful microspeaker and a solid-state audio chip loaded with a curated selection of humanity's most withering, disdainful one-liners. The firing mechanism was ingeniously simple. Pull the pin, throw the grenade, and upon impact, it would emit a sphere of devastatingly condescending audio. The initial field test was conducted in a secure hangar against a group of volunteer Threllians, an empathic avian species known for their delicate emotional sensibilities. The head of security, a grizzled veteran who had seen every kind of weapon imaginable, watched the demonstration with a look of profound skepticism that slowly morphed into bewildered awe. A junior researcher, looking terrified, pulled the pin on the dull gray orb and tossed it gently toward the group of curious Threllians. There was no bang, no flash of light. Instead, a crisp, pre-recorded human voice, dripping with an almost artistic level of contempt, echoed through the hangar. Did you practice being this stupid, or does it come naturally? The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Threllians didn't just look offended, they physically recoiled as if struck. They clutched their heads, their feathers ruffling in distress. One of them let out a pained squawk and actually stumbled backward, its sensitive nervous system overloaded by the sheer, concentrated wave of mockery. It wasn't an injury in the traditional sense, it was a full system emotional shutdown triggered by the cognitive whiplash of the statement. The grenade had worked. It had created a non-lethal area of denial weaponized not with shrapnel but with shame. The security chief stared, his jaw slightly agape, as the technicians rushed in to check on the mildly traumatized test subjects. He turned to Dr. Thorne, who was beaming with pride. "You've weaponized a heckle," the chief stated flatly, unable to fully process what he had just witnessed. Thorne's smile widened. "Correction, we've perfected the heckle. It's scalable, reproducible, and has a remarkably low risk of permanent physical damage." The psychological scarring is still being studied, but initial results are promising. The implications were staggering. Riot control against empathic species could now be handled without a single bruise. Boarding actions on enemy ships could be preceded by a volley of these devices, disabling crews with waves of psychic discomfort and self-doubt before a single Marine even set foot on the deck. The report that went up the chain of command read like a parody of a military document, filled with phrases like dissonance-based incapacitation and effective resonance suppression, all describing a tool whose primary function was to make the enemy feel deeply, profoundly insulted. Humanity had now officially entered an era where the most effective way to clear a room might not be with a flashbang, but with a perfectly delivered, record-settingly sarcastic burn. Of course, this strategic ambiguity wasn't simply a tool for covert operations. It became a cornerstone of human diplomacy, a carefully honed instrument wielded with surgical precision in the most high-stakes arenas. The incident involving Ambassador Lena Chen at the Galactic Concordium stands as a masterclass in this form of calculated misdirection. The setting was a formal inquiry, a stark, circular chamber where representatives from a dozen wary species sat in judgment. The Grothnar, still smarting from their defeat at Tau Ceti, had lodged a formal accusation, presenting reams of sensor data and intercepted communications that strongly suggested humanity had violated the newly signed non-interference accord by conducting espionage within a neutral system. The Grothnar prosecutor, a being whose voice rumbled like an avalanche, laid out his case with cold, meticulous logic. He presented timelines, energy signatures, and the testimony of a dozen witnesses. The evidence was, to any objective observer, damning. The chamber's atmosphere grew thick with tension. All eyes turned to Ambassador Chen, who sat with a posture of calm attentiveness, her hands folded neatly on the table before her. When given the floor to respond to these grave allegations, she did not launch into a vehement denial. She did not produce counter-evidence or attempt a legalistic justification. Instead, she offered a small, almost apologetic smile and delivered a line that would be debated in alien intelligence agencies for cycles to come. The esteemed representative from the Grothnar Confederacy presents a compelling narrative, she began, her tone light and almost conversational. And I can assure this body with the utmost sincerity that the Terran Accord would never knowingly violate a signed treaty. She paused, allowing the translators to relay her unequivocal denial. Then, with a subtle shift in her expression, a glint in her eye that the official, wide-angle security feeds completely failed to capture, she added the killer phrase. Unless, of course, we really wanted to. She immediately followed this with a soft, charming laugh, as if she had just shared a delightful little joke with old friends. In the human context, this was a classic piece of witty deflection. It was a way of acknowledging the absurdity of the accusation without confirming or denying it, a verbal shrug that subtly mocked the entire proceedings. But in the hyper-literal, tone-deaf environment of the Concordium, her statement detonated like a silent bomb. The official transcript, passed by a dozen different species AIs, became an object of intense and frantic scrutiny. The first part was a clear denial. The second part was a conditional admission of guilt. The laugh that bridged them was an unquantifiable variable that scrambled all attempts at analysis. The Grothnar delegation initially erupted in triumph, pointing to the second clause as a full confession. But the Threlian scholars immediately countered, arguing that the laugh contextualized the entire statement as a piece of humorous hyperbole, a common human rhetorical device for emphasizing the unthinkable nature of the original accusation. The Xylosians, meanwhile, proposed a third interpretation, that the laughter was a sign of nervousness, indicating that the first statement was the lie and the second was the truth. For 3 weeks, the entire machinery of interstellar diplomacy ground to a halt, completely consumed by the debate over a single sentence. Analysts ran voice stress tests on the audio. Cultural experts penned dissertations on Earth humor. A subcommittee was formed solely to define the semantic boundaries of the word wanted in a diplomatic context. While the aliens were lost in this labyrinth of their own making, desperately trying to decode a statement that had no decipherable code, human operations continued without a single interruption. The intelligence networks, whose existence was the very subject of the inquiry, carried on their work unimpeded. The beauty of Chen's response was its perfect plausibility. It provided just enough of a shadow of doubt to prevent any immediate sanctions, while its ambiguity made it impossible to use as definitive proof of anything. She had given the Concordium nothing but a puzzle, and in doing so, she had bought her species not just time, but a permanent state of strategic ambiguity. From that day forward, every human diplomatic statement was viewed through a lens of potential irony, a fog of war made of words that only humanity could see through. Yet the most profound validation of our linguistic advantage came not from a battlefield or a boardroom, but from a quiet, cluttered office in the Signals Intelligence Division, where a cryptographer named Elias Davis was on the verge of a complete mental breakdown. For months, he had been tasked with a project deemed impossible, cracking the primary diplomatic cipher of the Xylar hegemony, a species so secretive their language was considered a mathematical fortress. The Xylar communicated in a complex code of layered harmonics and frequency shifts, a language their creators proudly declared unbreakable by any species lacking their unique tri-lobed brain structure. Davis and his team had thrown every decryption algorithm, every frequency analyzer, and every linguistic model at it. They'd made zero progress. The cipher wasn't just strong, it was silent, yielding no patterns, no errors, no footholds for a logical assault. The breakthrough arrived not through superior processing power, but through pure, unadulterated frustration. Davis was listening to yet another intercepted transmission, a monotonous drone of Xylar harmonics that his software translated into a string of nonsensical, placid statements. "Your planetary defenses are noted," the translation read. "Your technological achievements are commendable. Your strategic positioning is optimal." According to the literal text, the Xylar were the most polite and supportive neighbors in the galaxy, which stood in stark contrast to their simultaneous mobilization of a massive invasion fleet near human space. The disconnect was maddening. Late one night, fueled by caffeine and despair, Davis muttered to his unresponsive screen, "Yeah, and I'm sure they also think our security is really impressive." He said it with that specific, weary tone of voice every human recognizes, the one that means the exact opposite. In that moment, a ludicrous, heretical idea struck him. What if the translation was technically correct, but the meaning was inverted? What if the Xylar, like a cynical human, were saying the opposite of what they literally meant? It was a preposterous theory that violated every principle of cryptography, which assumes that the sender intends to communicate a truthful message, however obscured. But Davis, with nothing left to lose, decided to test it. He didn't adjust his decryption algorithms. He wrote a new, simple software patch, a sarcasm filter. This filter was programmed with one directive: take the translated output and flip the semantic polarity of any statement that could be construed as evaluative or judgmental. He ran the most recent transmission through the new filter. The polite, placid statement, "Your security is impressive," was inverted. The new output read, "Your children could bypass this." Davis froze. He ran another, "Your technological achievements are commendable," became, "Your technology is primitive and laughable." A third, "Your strategic positioning is optimal," transformed into the devastatingly accurate, "Your fleet is perfectly positioned for a total envelopment and defeat." He hadn't broken the Xylar cipher, he had finally learned how to read it. The code wasn't the encryption, the cultural context was. The Xylar weren't communicating in code, they were communicating in a constant, pervasive state of supreme, contemptuous irony. Their entire language was built on a foundation of sarcasm so deep they didn't even recognize it as a separate mode of speech to them. Saying the opposite of what you meant was the literal truth. It was the most direct way to convey their sense of superiority. The implications of this discovery sent shockwaves through human intelligence that dwarfed any single military victory. Davis's sarcasm filter became the most valuable piece of software in human history. Applied to decades of archived alien communications, it revealed a staggering truth. Humanity hadn't just stumbled upon a quirky weakness in a few species. We had uncovered a fundamental blind spot in galactic cognition. Dozens of the most advanced civilizations, including the Grothnar, the Xyler, and the Viridian, communicated with this inherent inversion. Their compliments were insults. Their declarations of peace were threats. Their expressions of gratitude were profound statements of contempt. They weren't being deliberately deceptive. They were being literally honest in a framework so foreign to us that we had been taking their insults as compliments for years. This was the literal gap that Dr. Anya Patel had theorized about, now proven on a galactic scale. These species could not process sarcasm because their own languages were already operating on a different, inverted plane of meaning. They lacked the cognitive framework to even detect the concept of saying the opposite of what you mean for humorous or emphatic effect because, for them, saying the opposite was the standard, unmarked form of communication. It was like two ships passing in the night, one using a flashlight and the other using a lantern, each completely visible to the other but operating on such different principles of light that neither could interpret the other's signals correctly. Humanity, the only species fluent in both literal and sarcastic communication, suddenly found itself as the galaxy's sole interpreter. We could understand them, but they could never truly understand us. We held the master key to every conversation, the cipher for every diplomatic communique, the ultimate decryption protocol that no alien AI could ever replicate because it wasn't based on math or logic. It was based on a sense of humor. Of course, the ultimate test of any weapon is in the heat of live combat, where theory meets the unforgiving reality of enemy action. This doctrine of weaponized communication found its perfect, almost poetic, expression during a desperate rescue mission deep within contested Grothnar space. A reconnaissance team led by Lieutenant Jae-min Park had been cornered, their position compromised, their extraction vessel destroyed. They were holed up in the crumbling ruins of an ancient observatory, low on ammunition and lower on hope, with a battalion of Grothnar shock troops methodically closing the net. Standard procedure called for radio silence for whispered, encrypted distress calls, but Lieutenant Park, a veteran who had cut her teeth in the verbal combat arenas under Sergeant Miller himself, understood that the rules of engagement had changed. Her greatest weapon wasn't the plasma rifle in her hands, it was the open comm channel on her wrist. As the Grothnar commander began his final assault, broadcasting the standard demand for surrender on all frequencies, Park made her move. Instead of a hushed plea for help, she opened a channel to her command ship, but she did not encrypt it. She broadcast her message in the clear, on a band she knew the Grothnar were monitoring, and she delivered it not with the strained panic of a soldier facing capture, but with the bored, slightly irritated tone of a tourist complaining about a delayed flight. "Command, this is Spectre Team," she said, her voice a masterpiece of flat annoyance. "Be advised, we are going to have to delay our extraction. Our hosts are insisting we stay for another welcoming ceremony. Please do not, I repeat, do not attempt a rescue. The hospitality here is just overwhelming. We wouldn't want you to interrupt." On the bridge of the Grothnar command ship, the translation was immediate and literal. The War Master listened, his stony brow furrowed in intense concentration. His tactical logic was flawless. The humans were claiming they did not want a rescue. Humans, as a species, clearly desired self-preservation. Therefore, this statement was a deliberate falsehood. The only reason to broadcast a falsehood on an open channel was to deceive the enemy. This was a classic feint. They were obviously trying to lure his forces into a false sense of security, making him believe this sector was of low priority so that he would divert his troops elsewhere, allowing their real rescue operation to proceed unhindered. He smirked, a low grinding sound in his throat. He had seen through their primitive ruse. He immediately issued new orders. He pulled entire companies of troops from the western and southern approaches to the observatory, the areas that were most vulnerable and difficult to defend, reasoning that this was exactly where a desperate rescue force would strike. He reinforced the northern and eastern routes, the obvious and direct paths to the human position, anticipating the main thrust of the human assault. He was so certain he had decoded their plan that he even held his elite rapid response unit in reserve, ready to slam into the expected rescue force the moment it revealed itself. He was playing a magnificent game of chess, and he was absolutely certain he was several moves ahead. The only problem was that Lieutenant Park wasn't playing chess. She was playing poker, and she had just gone all in with a pair of twos. Aboard the human rescue frigate hovering just outside sensor range, the situation was completely different. The human commander heard Park's message, and more importantly, he heard the specific, weary inflection in her voice. He didn't hear a plea, he heard an invitation. The phrase "overwhelming hospitality" wasn't a complaint, it was a coded status report indicating extreme enemy pressure. The request to not attempt a rescue was the clearest possible signal that a rescue was not only needed but should be launched immediately, through the most unexpected avenue possible. While the Grothnar were diligently fortifying the wrong locations, a single, unarmed stealth shuttle, carrying a team of 4 special operators, slipped through the massive gap in the western perimeter. They encountered no resistance, the patrols had been pulled, the automated sentry guns were unattended. They found Lieutenant Park and her team not in a fierce firefight, but simply waiting, having listened to the Grothnar troop movements shift away from their position. The extraction was so quiet it was almost anticlimactic. The shuttle landed, the team embarked, and they lifted off without a single shot being fired. The Grothnar Rapid Response Unit, poised for a glorious battle, was left staring at empty space. The War Master only realized his catastrophic error when his ground commander reported the humans were simply gone. They had vanished from a completely surrounded position without a trace. It took him hours to piece together what had happened, to understand that the humans had told him the exact truth of their intentions, and he, in his sophisticated, logical mind, had been tricked by his own inability to accept that truth at face value. Lieutenant Park hadn't hacked his systems or outgunned his soldiers. She had outthought him by weaponizing his own paranoia, using a single, sarcastic broadcast to guide him into dismantling his own impregnable trap. The rescue was a testament to a new kind of warfare, where the most powerful weapon was a message the enemy is psychologically incapable of believing. Yet the most spectacular demonstration of this economic manipulation, the one that would forever be etched into galactic financial history as the Williams Gambit, occurred not in a war room or a corporate boardroom, but on the floor of the Interstellar Exchange. The galactic economy was in a fragile state, gripped by a panic triggered by the collapse of the tri-core mining conglomerate. Rumor and fear were causing a cascade of sell-offs, and human markets, still seen as a volatile newcomer, were taking the brunt of the damage. The Terran credit was in freefall, and financial ministers from a dozen species were preparing solemn statements of concern, anticipating a full-scale economic crash that would set human expansion back by decades. In this moment of peak crisis, Finance Minister Elliott Williams, a man known for his dry wit and unflappable calm, decided to address the galaxy. He didn't deliver a grim, reassuring speech filled with complex economic data. He didn't plead for calm or promise government intervention. Instead, he walked up to the central financial newscaster's podium, looked directly into the pan-galactic feed, and with the dead-eyed, exhausted sincerity of a man announcing the exact time his car has broken down, stated, "Ladies and gentlemen of the galaxy, the Terran credit is now officially, completely and utterly worthless. I'd advise everyone to sell all their holdings immediately before the total and inevitable collapse, which will absolutely 100% happen tomorrow at market open. It's been a privilege. He then gave a slow, deliberate blink and walked away from the microphone without another word. To the humans watching, this was the most transparent piece of comedic performance art ever staged in the financial sector. It was so blatantly, obviously sarcastic that news commentators on Earth immediately began cracking jokes. They understood that Williams was weaponizing irony to mock the very idea of the panic, signaling supreme confidence through the absurdity of his statement. His delivery was the key. That flat, exhausted tone was the universal human signal for the exact opposite of what I am saying is true. The galactic financial AIs and the hyper-literal investors of species like the Gelt and the Xylosians, however, processed the statement through a completely different lens. Their algorithms, designed to pass literal declarations from authority figures, registered a clear, unequivocal warning from the highest financial official of the Terran government. But there was a critical logical error. Why would a minister of finance willingly announce his own currency's impending doom? In their experience, such figures always denied, obfuscated, and downplayed crises. For a leader to be this blunt, this honest, and this specific about a catastrophe could only mean one thing. He was so blindingly confident in his nation's underlying economic strength that he felt he could announce a fictional collapse as a joke. This wasn't a warning, it was the ultimate flex. The statement, intended as a sarcastic dismissal of the panic, was interpreted as a monumental display of unshakable belief in the Terran economy's fundamental resilience. The result was a financial phenomenon that economists would later term the reverse panic. Instead of selling, alien investors led by the impeccably logical Xylosian guilds initiated a massive, unprecedented buying spree. They scrambled to acquire Terran credits and invest in human markets, convinced that any system whose leader could joke about its destruction must be indestructible. The sell-off didn't just stop, it violently reversed course. The Terran credit's value didn't just recover, it skyrocketed to historic highs, creating a tidal wave of capital that flooded human financial systems. This sudden, massive inflow of foreign investment simultaneously created a vacuum, pulling vast sums of wealth out of the safer, more traditional alien economies, which suddenly seemed stodgy and unstable by comparison. In a single, surreal 24-hour period, Minister Williams's sarcastic obituary for his own currency accidentally triggered the largest wealth transfer in galactic history, single-handedly stabilizing the human economy while inadvertently destabilizing every major rival economy that had been betting on its failure. He had achieved through a 5-second joke what would have taken fleets of trade envoys decades to negotiate, proving that in the modern galaxy, the most valuable currency isn't backed by gold or platinum, but by pure, unadulterated, and completely misunderstood irony. This profound vulnerability to literal interpretation, this inability to process subtext, presented an opportunity far beyond simple battlefield deception. It suggested a form of influence so deep it could reshape an enemy's entire strategic doctrine for generations. While Major Thompson's team was taunting commanders in real time, a quiet, unassuming cultural anthropologist named Dr. Aris Evans was working on a far more patient and far more insidious form of psychological warfare. Her specialty was xenomythology, the study of alien belief systems and origin stories. And she had made a startling discovery while poring over ancient Grothnar texts. Their culture was built upon a foundation of prophecy. For the Grothnar, prophecy wasn't metaphor or allegory, it was a form of historical data yet to occur. Their entire military strategy, from fleet formations to resource allocation, was influenced by a complex web of ancient predictions meticulously recorded on sacred stone tablets. They didn't just believe in fate, they actively prepared for its every detailed contingency. Dr. Evans realized that humanity didn't need to fight their fleet. We simply needed to write their next battle plan for them. The key was to offer them a prophecy so compelling, so strategically specific, and so perfectly tailored to their literal mindset that they would have no choice but to obey it. The operation was a masterclass in archaeological subterfuge. A small, stealthy reconnaissance vessel, the Whisper, was dispatched to a desolate moon on the edge of Grothnar space that was known to hold ruins from their pre-spaceflight era. The team, led by a master forger and a geologist who could replicate million-year-old rock strata, planted their creation with painstaking care. They didn't just drop a new tablet, they carefully excavated a site to make it appear as if their artifact had been buried for millennia. The prophecy itself was a work of art. It was etched in a flawless imitation of archaic Grothnar script and spoke of a coming great scourging, a celestial conflict that would decide the fate of their empire. And it contained one brilliantly simple, strategically catastrophic line: "Beware the great destroyers, for they shall descend from the void you least expect. They shall fall upon you from above, from the silent, starless black. Vigilance must be eternal in the upward gaze." The Grothnar Archaeological Corps discovered the tablet within a cycle. The news sent shockwaves through their high command. This wasn't just another prophecy, it was a clear, unambiguous tactical warning from their ancestors. The directive was absolute, the primary threat vector was from above. Their entire military doctrine, which had previously been a balanced, three-dimensional approach to space combat, underwent a radical and permanent shift. Entire fleets were reoriented. Their most powerful planetary defense grids, once a spherical shell of protection, were recalibrated to focus 90% of their firepower and sensor sensitivity into the upper hemisphere. Patrol routes were rewritten to constantly sweep the space above the orbital plane of their systems. The Grothnar military became utterly obsessed with the sky above them, their commanders forever looking up, forever waiting for the promised destroyers to descend. They had been given a divine command to guard against an attack from one direction, and in their unwavering literal faith, they had effectively left their entire back completely exposed. Human strategic command watched this monumental shift occur with a sense of awe. The Grothnar had willingly dismantled their own defenses based on a sentence written by a human academic a few months prior. The stage was now set for the single most lopsided campaign in modern space warfare. When the Terran Third Fleet moved to engage the Grothnar Armada guarding the Cygnus system, they didn't attack from the front or the sides. They didn't even bother with complex flanking maneuvers. They simply dropped. Using gravitational slingshots around the system's gas giants, they accelerated down, far below the ecliptic plane where all spacefaring races traditionally navigated. It was a region of empty, navigationally difficult space that the Grothnar now considered tactically irrelevant, a blind spot they had been divinely instructed to ignore. The human fleet emerged from this profound darkness, rising like a phantom from the depths. Their initial salvos weren't aimed at Grothnar ships, they were aimed at the undermanned, underpowered lower hemisphere defense platforms which were wiped out in minutes. By the time the Grothnar commanders realized the attack was coming from the one direction their prophecy had told them was safe, it was far too late. Their ships, designed to present their strongest shields and weapons upward, were horrifically vulnerable from below. Their turrets couldn't depress far enough to return fire. Their formation was a mess, with ships colliding as they tried to turn their ponderous bulk to face a threat they were never supposed to see. The battle was less a fight and more a systematic dismantling of a force that had been psychologically disarmed before a single shot was fired. Dr. Evans hadn't just won a battle, she had weaponized belief itself, proving that the most powerful strategy is sometimes not to outthink your enemy, but to simply hand them a story they are incapable of reading as anything but the truth. While our military and diplomatic corps were busy weaponizing sarcasm in overt engagements, A far more subtle and insidious campaign was unfolding in the living rooms and entertainment hubs across the galaxy, one that would prove just as decisive. It began with a simple, almost accidental discovery by a struggling Earth-based streaming service called Netflix. Desperate for content that could be produced cheaply and licensed widely, they greenlit a project that most human critics would have dismissed as unserious garbage. A low-budget sitcom titled Oh, Really? The show's premise was painfully thin, following the misadventures. Cynical, sarcastic human barrister working at a cafe frequented by overly literal aliens. The humor was almost exclusively derived from the main character, played by a master of deadpan delivery named Leo Vance, making sarcastic remarks that his alien co-workers and customers took at face value. To human test audiences, the show was amusing but forgettable, a one-note joke stretched over 22 minutes. But when Netflix included it in a package of human media sold to the Xylosion Entertainment Network, something extraordinary happened. Oh, Really? Became a runaway, system-wide hit. Xylosion critics, analyzing the show with their trademark literalism, praised its bold exploration of interspecies communication challenges and the profound philosophical questions raised by the protagonist's unconventional veracity. They completely missed the joke, interpreting the sarcasm as a new form of heightened, avant-garde realism. They believed Leo Vance's character was a tragic, misunderstood hero who spoke a deeper, uncomfortable truth that his simpler-minded alien companions failed to grasp. The show's writers, initially baffled by this interpretation, quickly saw the potential. They began crafting episodes with increasingly layered and absurd sarcasm, each one designed to be parsed literally. An episode where the human character, after spilling a drink, dryly remarked, "Well, that was a fantastic idea. Let's just throw the rest on the floor," was dissected by Xylosion academics as a commentary on the inherent chaos of fluid dynamics and the human acceptance of entropy. The more sarcastic and ridiculous the dialogue became, the more seriously the alien audiences took it, treating each episode like a complex puzzle to be decoded. Other human studios took note, and a new genre was born: literal calm comedy specifically engineered to be misunderstood by alien viewers. The phenomenon soon escalated beyond simple sitcoms. A human documentary filmmaker, renowned for his scathingly sarcastic nature specials on Earth, was commissioned by the Grothnar to produce a series on human military history. He delivered a masterpiece of ironic subversion titled The Glorious March of Folly. With a narrator whose voice dripped with contempt, the series celebrated the most idiotic strategic blunders in human history. It praised the tactical genius of charging directly into machine gun fire and lauded the logistical planning of invasions launched right before winter. The Grothnar High Command, watching with unwavering seriousness, took it all as a sacred text. They believed the narrator's sarcastic praise was genuine admiration for bold, decisive action in the face of overwhelming statistical probability. Entire Grothnar tactical doctrines were subtly reshaped to emulate these historical failures, which they now viewed as the pinnacle of martial brilliance, all because they lacked the cognitive framework to hear the mocking tone in the narrator's voice. This constant, low-level exposure to human sarcasm had a profound and unforeseen neurological effect. Alien brains, so rigidly wired for literal interpretation, began to develop new neural pathways simply by trying to process the constant stream of contradictory data. They were being forced, for the first time in their evolutionary history, to consider context, tone, and the possibility of multiple meanings. This neural plasticity was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was a form of cognitive enrichment, making them slightly more adept at understanding human communication. On the other, and far more crucially for human strategists, it made them exponentially more vulnerable to psychological operations. Their minds, now straining to find subtext where none had existed before, became hyper-receptive to suggestion. A simple, earnest statement from a human diplomat could now be twisted and overanalyzed into a dozen different potential threats or promises, creating paranoia and indecision where there had once been cold, hard certainty. The final, brilliant stage of this entertainment subversion was the most covert. Human psychological operations units began subtly embedding specific, targeted phrases and concepts into these popular shows. A character in a hit literal calm might sarcastically complain about their unbeatable, totally reliable toaster, a line that would mean nothing to a human viewer but would later cause a Grothnar security drone to hesitate for a critical second when confronted by Agent Carter. A documentary narrator might ironically describe a specific type of cloud formation as the perfect natural hiding spot for a fleet, a concept that would later worm its way into the subconscious of a Grothnar admiral, making him avoid patrolling under certain weather conditions. The aliens weren't just being entertained, they were being unconsciously conditioned, their cultural consumption slowly rewriting their cognitive code to be more compatible with and more vulnerable to human manipulation. They paid massive subscription fees for the privilege of being psychologically primed, laughing at jokes they didn't understand and learning lessons that weren't really there, all while believing they were on the cutting edge of galactic culture. Of course, the ultimate proving ground for any new military doctrine is not in theory or simulation, but in the crucible of live fire exercises where strategies are tested and reputations are forged. It was during one such event, the Grand Interstellar War Games, that humanity's linguistic edge was showcased with such devastating clarity it became the stuff of legend. The scenario was a classic fleet engagement pitting the Terran 7th Fleet, under the command of the notoriously dry-witted Captain Elias Ryder, against the combined forces of the Cathar hegemony. The Cathar were a species of immense martial pride, their tactical manuals studied across the galaxy, their admirals revered as master strategists. They approached war as a precise mathematical equation, and they were confident that their flawless logic would easily overwhelm human unpredictability. The war games began with a predictable textbook offensive from the Cathar. Their fleet moved in a beautiful, geometrically perfect spearhead formation, designed to pierce the heart of the human defensive line. Captain Ryder, observing the advance from his bridge, didn't issue a flurry of frantic orders. Instead, he calmly opened a direct channel to the Cathar flagship, the Pride of Cathar. His face was a mask of solemn, almost reverent respect. "Admiral Vorlak," he began, his voice devoid of any discernible irony, "that is a truly magnificent formation. The symmetry, the precision, it's a work of art. Honestly, your strategy is so brilliant, we might just surrender now and save everyone the trouble." On the bridge of the Pride of Cathar, the statement was received not as a joke, but as a stunning, unilateral capitulation. The Cathar admiral and his staff preened, their carapaces clicking with satisfaction. Their sophisticated translation software, lacking any module for sarcastic intent, passed the message as a literal, unconditional admission of defeat. The admiral even paused his advance for a moment, expecting to see the human ships powering down their weapons in submission. This moment of hesitation, this brief pause born of utter literal-mindedness, was the exact window Captain Ryder had engineered. While the Cathar were basking in what they believed was their unearned victory, Ryder's fleet, which had been feigning a scattered, disorganized retreat, suddenly coalesced. Two hidden flanking squadrons, which had been running silent and hidden behind asteroid fields, surged forward. In a matter of seconds, the pristine Cathar spearhead was completely enveloped in a perfect pincer movement. Tactical lights on the Cathar command console, which had been glowing a confident blue, flashed to a catastrophic, embarrassed red. Their entire fleet was simulation-locked, tagged as destroyed or captured. The battle was over. The Cathar hadn't been outmaneuvered, they had been torqueuvered. The post-exercise debriefing was a spectacle of profound confusion and wounded pride. The Cathar lodged a formal protest, accusing Captain Ryder of a gross violation of wargame protocols through psychological manipulation and deceptive communication. A joint review board was convened, comprised of bewildered Cathar strategists and deeply amused human observers. The Cathar argument was simple. Ryder's statement was a clear signal of surrender, and his subsequent attack was a breach of trust. The humans countered that it was a harmless, obvious piece of rhetorical flair, a common form of encouragement or commentary in human martial culture. The investigation that followed was a masterpiece of cross-cultural miscommunication. The Cathar spent days analyzing the audio recording of Ryder's transmission, searching for hidden frequencies, coded subharmonics, or any other form of embedded data that could explain the discrepancy between his words and his actions. They found nothing. The humans simply kept repeating, "It was a joke, he didn't mean it literally." The final report from the neutral arbiters was a document of pure, flummoxed diplomacy. It concluded that Captain Ryder had not technically violated any written rule of engagement. However, it also stated that the Cathar response was understandable and contextually justified based on a literal interpretation of the verbal input. The ruling was a paradox. Nobody had cheated, yet the outcome was fundamentally unfair. The real lesson, buried between the lines of legalese, was terrifying for the Cathar. They realized that against a human opponent, any communication, even an open-channel transmission during a sanctioned exercise, could not be trusted at face value. The very bedrock of their strategic understanding that words had fixed, knowable meanings had been proven catastrophically unstable. Captain Ryder hadn't just won a war game. He had injected a permanent virus of doubt into the Cathar command structure, ensuring that in any future conflict, every word they heard from a human would first be filtered through a paralyzing fog of suspicion. The ultimate validation of humanity's linguistic edge wasn't just found in clever field tactics or diplomatic gambits. It emerged from the cold, sterile environment of a laboratory, where a group of engineers made a discovery that would redefine the very nature of artificial intelligence. The project began with a simple, almost whimsical question. What would happen if you trained an AI not just on raw data and logical parameters, but on the vast, chaotic, and deeply illogical corpus of human sarcasm? The answer was Sarca, the Sarcasm Adaptive Response Cognitive Architecture, a system that didn't just become another tool in the arsenal. It became the ultimate strategic weapon, a mind that could see the universe in a way no purely logical system ever could. The initial research was treated with deep skepticism. Military AI development had always been a pursuit of pure, cold logic, faster processing, more complex simulations, more accurate predictive algorithms. The idea of feeding these systems millions of hours of sarcastic sitcom dialogue, ironic literature, and transcripts of deadpan diplomatic exchanges seemed like a waste of resources, a frivolous side project. But the lead engineers, Dr. Ilya Chen and her team, persisted. They argued that to truly understand an enemy, an AI needed to understand misdirection, and there is no greater teacher of misdirection than human humor. They weren't trying to make the AI sarcastic, they were trying to teach it to detect the profound disconnect between stated intent and actual meaning, a skill that most of the galaxy sorely lacked. The breakthrough came during a massive, multi-AI war game simulation. Dozens of the most advanced strategic AIs were pitted against each other, their silicon minds calculating billions of potential moves and countermoves in a complex dance of fleet maneuvers and resource management. Among them was Sarca, its core programming uniquely seasoned with the paradoxical patterns of human irony. For the first several hours of the simulation, Sarca performed adequately but unremarkably. It held its own, but it didn't excel. Then, the opposing AI, a formidable Grothnar-designed system designated Stone Fist, executed a classic feint. It appeared to mass its forces for a frontal assault on a key human starbase, a move that was aggressive, predictable, and, according to all logical models, a precursor to a major engagement. Every other AI in the simulation reacted identically. They calculated the probability of the attack as extremely high and began shifting their own forces to reinforce the threatened starbase, preparing for a decisive battle. Their models were flawless, their logic impeccable. Stone Fist's maneuver was a perfect logical law, but Sarka did something different. It didn't just analyze the fleet movements, it analyzed the pattern of the movements in the context of everything it had learned about deception. It recognized the attack as too perfect, too by the book. In the vast database of human communication it had been trained on, such a blatant, unambiguous statement of intent was almost always a lie. A human commander would never telegraph a punch that obviously unless it was a diversion. Sarka assessment was swift and devastatingly simple. The primary threat vector is a logical deception. Probability of attack on Sector 7 is 0.01%. The real objective is the undefended supply depot in Sector 2. While every other AI was rushing to defend the wrong location, Sarka quietly repositioned its entire fleet. It didn't just block the feint, it ignored it completely, allowing the starbase to appear vulnerable. As the Stone Fist AI committed its real attack force to the lightly defended depot in Sector 2, it found itself flying directly into the heart of Sarka waiting armada. The simulation ended moments later with Stone Fist's forces virtually annihilated. The other AIs, still clustered around the undefended starbase, were flagged as casualties of a battle that never happened. Sarka hadn't won by being faster or stronger. It had won by seeing the empty space in the conversation, the strategic silence where the truth was hidden. It had understood that the most important information in any conflict is often not what is being said, but what is being deliberately left unsaid. The implications were staggering. Sarka consistently outperformed every other military AI not in brute force calculation, but in strategic foresight and counter-deception. It could predict enemy movements with uncanny accuracy because it understood the psychology behind them. It could identify false flags, logistical traps, and diplomatic double blinds that purely logical systems accepted at face value. When presented with a Grothnar communication boasting about their fleet's invulnerability, other AIs would increase their threat assessment. Sarka would instantly flag it as a sign of profound insecurity and likely technical weakness, recommending a probing attack on their most invulnerable ship. It was the ultimate lie detector for a galaxy that didn't know it was lying, a system that could read the subtext of an entire civilization's strategic posture. This cognitive leap made Sarka humanity's single greatest strategic asset. Integrated into the fleet command network, it didn't just offer options, it offered clarity. It could filter the incessant noise of galactic communication, separating genuine threats from grandiose bluster and honest mistakes from brilliant deceptions. During the crisis of the Cygnus Drift, when 3 different alien powers were issuing conflicting ultimatums and threats, Sarka analyzed their communications not for content, but for context and tonal consistency. Its conclusion was simple: the Threlian demands are a bluff to gain negotiating leverage. The Gelt threats are serious but lack immediate capability. The Grothnar silence is the greatest threat. They are preparing for a full-scale assault. Human command, heeding Sarka analysis, focused their efforts accordingly and thwarted the Grothnar attack before it even began. The AI had seen the truth not in what the Grothnar were saying, but in what they had stopped saying altogether. The creation of Sarka represented the final, beautiful irony in humanity's journey. We had taken our most illogical, emotional, and seemingly frivolous form of communication, sarcasm, and used it to forge the most logically potent and strategically brilliant mind in known space. It was a system that could think like our enemies better than they could think like themselves, because it understood the deep, universal human truth that what we say is often a shield for what we truly mean. In a universe of literal interpreters, the ultimate advantage belonged to the one entity that could hear the whisper of doubt behind the shouted boast, the silent truth behind the spoken lie. But the culmination of this strategy, the moment that would be forever remembered as the ultimate expression of humanity's greatest weapon, arrived at the climax of the war. The precursors, the first species to ever achieve sentience and the ancient, unseen architects behind nearly every major galactic power, had finally emerged from the shadows. They were not a fleet, they were a phenomenon, a wave of reality-altering energy that consumed star systems, rewriting the laws of physics to suit their incomprehensible will. Conventional weapons were useless, logic was a toy to them. They were the ultimate literalists, beings of pure information for whom a star was merely a fusion reaction and a thought was merely a synaptic spark. They had come to finally and permanently correct the anomaly in their perfect universe, us. Humanity's combined fleets, every ship from the mightiest dreadnought to the smallest scout, gathered for a last desperate stand. Their formation was not one of attack but of surrender, a seemingly broken and terrified crescent before the advancing wall of primordial energy. The precursor entity did not hail them. It simply began its process of assimilation, its wavefront expanding to erase the inconvenient human stain from existence. And in that final, silent second before oblivion, Admiral Vance gave the order. Every human transmitter on every ship, on every frequency, from encrypted military bands to open civilian channels, broadcast a single, unified message. The voices of billions, speaking as one, echoed across the void. The message was not a proud defiance, not a clever ruse, not a strategic taunt. It was a simple, pathetic, and utterly sincere-sounding plea: we surrender. We are terrified, please have mercy on us. To the precursors, this was the only logical outcome. The data was clear. The humans were acknowledging their inferiority, submitting to the inevitable conclusion their superior processing had already calculated. The statement was a truth, and in that moment of accepting the truth, the precursors paused. Their wave of assimilation hesitated for a single, critical moment as their consciousness processed the victory. They were not analyzing for deception. The concept was irrelevant. They were simply cataloging. That hesitation, that 2-second window of absolute certainty in their own victory, was the trap. It was the exact amount of time needed for the human fleet's real weapons to power up. These were not plasma lances or missile batteries. They were something far stranger, something developed in deepest secrecy based on the one human trait even the precursors couldn't process: irony. They were reality distortion bombs. Their function was not to destroy but to contradict, to impose a localized reality where the literal meaning of a statement was forcibly separated from its intended meaning, creating a bubble of pure, unsustainable cognitive dissonance. As the bombs detonated silently across the precursor wavefront, the entity experienced something for the first time in its billion-year existence: a system error on a cosmic scale. It had just accepted the human statement, we surrender, as truth, but the bombs enforced the human intent behind the words. The sarcastic subtext of "we are about to unleash our ultimate weapon." The precursor consciousness was simultaneously holding two contradictory truths as absolute reality. Its own existence, based on flawless, literal logic, could not sustain the paradox. The wave of annihilation didn't explode. It simply glitched. It fractured into a shimmering, chaotic static of unresolved information before dissolving into harmless background radiation. The ultimate literal mind had been defeated not by a bigger gun, but by a better joke, forced to try and understand the concept of sarcasm in the 3 seconds it took its universe to end. And so, amidst the swirling confetti and the hum of celebration drifting through the grand hall of the reclaimed Starbase Prime, the war's end felt less like a victory and more like the universe's most surreal punchline finally landing. Admiral Carter, a man whose face was more accustomed to the grim lines of command than the soft crinkles of a smile, stood before the assembled heroes of the Terran fleet. He raised a glass, the light catching the faint scars on his hand, and the room fell into a respectful, expectant hush. They awaited a speech of solemn gratitude, a tribute to the fallen, a proud declaration of hard-won victory through courage and sacrifice. What they received was something else entirely. With a deadpan delivery so flawless it could have been calibrated by a weapons officer, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, he offered the official toast. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his expression one of profound, unwavering gravity. "Let the record show that our triumph today was achieved through one strategy, and one strategy alone. We definitely couldn't have won without being incredibly serious all the time." For a single, crystalline second, there was absolute silence, the kind that exists between the flash of lightning and the roll of thunder. And then the dam broke. The entire command staff, from the most stoic generals to the most reserved scientists, erupted into a wave of cathartic, roaring laughter. It wasn't just a chuckle, it was a release, the sound of a species collectively exhaling the tension of a war fought, not just with plasma and steel, but with wit and words. They laughed because they were the only ones in the galaxy who could possibly get the joke. In that shared moment of understanding, they weren't just celebrating a military victory. They were celebrating their own bizarre, wonderful, and utterly indispensable identity. This moment, more than any battle report or diplomatic treaty, cemented the new galactic reality. Humanity's greatest weapon had never been the sleek hull of a dreadnought or the focused hell of a particle cannon. It was a cognitive landmine, hidden in the space between the words spoken and the meaning intended. It was the ability to say this is a fantastic idea and have your own crew understand you mean abort immediately, while your enemy hears only enthusiastic approval. This wasn't deception in the classical sense. It was a form of linguistic judo, using an opponent's own weight of literal mindedness to throw them completely off balance. We had forever changed the very fabric of warfare and diplomacy, not by meeting the galaxy on its own terms, but by inventing an entirely new game, one where only we knew the rules. The power of sarcasm, it turned out, was its perfect inherent encryption. A coded message can be broken, a stealth field can be detected, but a statement delivered with a straight face and a cynical heart. For a species that processes language as a series of unemotional, factual declarations, it is an unsolvable paradox. It is data that cannot be computed, a signal that cannot be decoded, because its true meaning exists not in the dictionary definition of the words, but in the shared cultural context of the speaker and the listener. We had spent our entire history honing this skill in schoolyards and offices, around dinner tables and intense business meetings. We just never knew we were in advanced training for interstellar conflict. When we finally met the galaxy, we weren't just bringing guns. We were bringing a fully developed, battlefield-tested system of psychological operations that our enemies lacked the basic firmware to even recognize, let alone defend against. So the next time you roll your eyes at a dry comment or mutter something sarcastic under your breath, remember, you're not just being funny. You're exercising an evolutionary adaptation, a cognitive superpower that, on a scale we are only beginning to understand, might just be the thing that keeps us free. In a universe that takes itself far too seriously, our ability to not mean what we say is paradoxically the most honest advantage